The sheriff's patrol car kicked up a cloud of dust as it rolled to a stop in the long, gravel driveway of my grandfather's ranch, the flashing lights painting the old, weathered wood of the cabin in frantic strobing flashes of red and blue. Standing on the porch, her face a mask of pure, vindictive triumph, was Brenda, the president of the Pioneer Bluffs Homeowners Association. She was pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at me. "That's him, Sheriff," she shrieked, her voice a shrill instrument of manufactured hysteria. "That's the squatter. This property has been abandoned for a year, and it is in the process of being legally annexed by the HOA for nuisance abatement. This man is a vagrant, a trespasser. He's been making threats. I want him arrested and removed from our community immediately." The sheriff, a big, calm, and deeply patient man named Frank, a man I had until now ever seen at county commission meetings, slowly got out of his car. He adjusted his hat, his eyes scanning the scene with a weary professionalism. He looked at Brenda, who was practically vibrating with self-righteous glee. He looked at me, standing there in my dusty jeans and a worn-out flannel shirt, my hands covered in a fine layer of sawdust from the work I'd been doing in the barn. And then, a slow, easy grin spread across his face. He ignored Brenda and her frantic accusations completely. He just looked at me, a man he had never formally met, but whose family name was woven into the very fabric of the county. And he gave a respectful, almost deferential nod. "Well, Mr. Sterling," the sheriff said, his voice a deep, a friendly rumble that echoed in the sudden, tense silence. "What are your orders?" "As you know, the Sterling Trust's annual funding stipend covers about 30% of my department's operational budget. We are, in a very real way, at your service." Brenda's face froze. Her jaw went slack. The triumphant, predatory gleam in her eyes was replaced by a look of pure, uncomprehending, catastrophic horror. The words "Mr. Sterling, the Trust, and at your service" just hung in the air, seeming to bend the very fabric of reality around her. And that's when everything went wrong. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment. What would you do if this happened to you? And subscribe to HOA Files to understand that moment, that beautiful, surreal collision of imagined power and real foundational authority. You have to understand the history of this land, and the almost mythical figure who was my great-great-grandfather. My name is Alex Sterling, and until 6 months ago, my life was a quiet, academic one. I was a historian, a specialist in the history of the American West. My world was one of dusty archives, of faded maps, of the silent, powerful stories of the past. My own family's story was one of those epic tales. My great-great-grandfather, a man named Jedediah Sterling, was one of the first settlers in this part of the state. He was a rancher, a prospector, a man of incredible vision and fortitude. And in 1884, for his services to the territory, he was given a massive land grant by the federal government. Not a few hundred acres, not a few thousand. He was granted the rights to the entire 500,000-acre valley that would one day become Sterling County. Over the next century, my family, through the Sterling Family Trust, acted as the stewards of this vast wilderness. They sold off parcels of land to create towns. They donated land for schools and parks, and in some cases, to generate income for the Trust's conservation work. They created long-term, 99-year land leases for developers. When my own grandfather, the last of the old guard, passed away last year, the full, crushing, and unbelievable weight of this legacy fell to me. I was the last of the line. I was now the sole managing trustee of the Sterling Land Grant. I was, in a strange, archaic, and deeply profound sense, the owner of the entire county. I was overwhelmed. I was a historian, not a land baron. I left my university job and moved into the original 150-year-old homestead cabin, the first structure my great-great-grandfather had built. To try and get my head around the massive, sprawling responsibility I had just inherited. The problem was that the world had changed. My family's historic and very private ranch was now bordered by a new, massive, and aggressively modern development called Pioneer Bluffs, It was a gated community of multi-million-dollar homes, built on a 5,000-acre parcel of land that had been leased from my family's trust back in the 1980s. The residents, of course, had no idea. They thought they owned their little patches of paradise. And the self-appointed queen of this leased kingdom was the HOA president, Brenda. Brenda was a newcomer with new money, a woman who had a deep and profound resentment for the old ways of our rural county. She was a vocal political opponent of the old guard families, like mine, who she saw as obstacles to her vision of a modern, exclusive, and highly profitable new era. My very first interaction with her was a perfect omen of the madness to come. I was at the ranch, a quiet, unassuming man in my 30s, dressed in old work clothes, trying to repair a section of the historic stone fence. She came zipping up in her golf cart, a look of open disgust on her face. She didn't recognize me. She just saw a man doing manual labor on a property she considered an eyesore. "Excuse me?" she'd called out, her voice sharp with unearned authority. "I am Brenda, the president of the Pioneer Bluffs HOA. You need to tell the owner of this place that it is a disgrace. It is a blight on our community. This entire property has been abandoned and is in a state of terminal decay. You can tell him that the HOA has plans for it. We will not have this rural slum dragging down our property values." I was stunned by the sheer, breathtaking arrogance of her words. She was standing on land leased from my family, and she was calling my family's historic homestead a slum. "I'll be sure to pass that along." "Ma'am," I'd said, my voice quiet. The war began a week later. I received a formal and deeply insulting letter at the ranch from the HOA. It was an offer to purchase the 500-acre homestead parcel from the Sterling estate for a price that wouldn't have paid the annual property taxes on it. The letter was full of condescending language, and it implied not so subtly that if the heirs refused to sell, the HOA would be forced to take legal action to abate the public nuisance of the abandoned and derelict property. I was the mayor of the nearby town. But here on my private land, I was just a citizen being bullied. I decided to handle this personally and quietly for now. I had the trust's lawyer send a polite but very firm refusal. Brenda, enraged by my defiance, began a campaign of systematic, bureaucratic harassment. She started filing a barrage of frivolous complaints with every county agency she could think of. She complained to the county health department about my cattle. She complained to the county environmental division about a creek on my property. She even complained to the county code enforcement about my 150-year-old historic barn. Each investigation was a massive, stressful hassle, a waste of taxpayer money, and a diversion of my own time and energy. My inner monologue was a raging storm. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. I was through my family's historic trust, one of the single largest taxpayers in the entire county, a primary funder of these very agencies. And this woman was successfully using them as a weapon of personal harassment against me. Brenda, furious that her official attacks were failing, decided to escalate. She held an emergency meeting of her HOA board. They passed a resolution, a work of pure, delusional fantasy. They voted to begin formal annexation proceedings for my ranch. It was a completely illegal, toothless gesture, but it was a declaration of her intent to seize my property. She had her lawyers draft and send me a formal notice, informing me that my property was now under the provisional jurisdiction of the HOA, and she immediately started sending me massive daily fines for her litany of imagined violations. The audacity was breathtaking. She was trying to create a legal fiction, a paper reality, to steal my family's home. And then she escalated from paper to people. The private road to my cabin crossed a small corner of the land they had leased from my trust. It was an access route that was guaranteed in the master lease. But Brenda didn't care about the master lease. She had her own rules. She had the HOA install a heavy iron gate across my road, and she refused to give me a key. She was physically cutting me off from my own home. My inner monologue was now a cold, hard calculation. This was no longer just harassment. This was a material breach of the master lease agreement. I was gathering my evidence. I was building my case. I came to the cabin one weekend to find she had hired a private security consultant, a large, thuggish-looking man, to guard the gate. He physically stood in my way and refused to let me pass. This was a major and very dangerous escalation. And then came her final, glorious, and catastrophically stupid move. Believing that she had successfully chased off the squatter and seen my quiet, continued refusal to engage as a sign of weakness, she decided it was time to bring in the law to finish the job. She called 911. She told the dispatcher that a violent and unstable vagrant was attempting to break into the abandoned cabin at the old Sterling Ranch. She was trying to have me arrested for trying to get into my own home. And that brings us back to that moment. The moment the county sheriff's car came rolling up my driveway. The moment she put on her hysterical award-winning performance. The moment my old friend, Sheriff Frank, stepped out of his car, the look of pure uncomprehending. An apocalyptic horror on Brenda's face as Sheriff Frank called me Mr. Sterling and then asked me for his orders was a thing of profound and deeply satisfying beauty. Her entire world, her entire sense of power and place was vaporized in that single, terrible instant. Orders. She stammered, her voice a pathetic, strangled squeak. What? What are you talking about? He's the trespasser. Sheriff Frank, a man whose family had lived in this county for as long as mine had, and who knew the real history of the land, just gave her a slow, sad shake of his head. He then proceeded to calmly, and with a kind of beautiful, brutal clarity, explain the reality of the situation. He explained it to his own confused deputies, and he explained it to a now catatonic Brenda. He explained that the entire Pioneer Bluffs development, every single house, every road, every blade of manicured grass, was on land that was part of a 99-year lease from the Sterling Family Trust. He explained that my quiet, unassuming self was, in fact, the managing trustee of that trust. He explained that I was, for all intents and purposes, her landlord. And then he explained the part that made her face turn the color of ash. He explained the historic funding agreement between the Sterling Trust and the Sterling County Sheriff's Department. An agreement put in place by my great-grandfather a century ago, in which the trust, as the county's largest landowner, provided a massive annual stipend to the department to ensure that the law was always enforced in this remote, rural corner of the state. So you see, ma'am, the sheriff concluded, his voice now as cold as a mountain winter, not only have you just illegally blocked the access of your own landlord, and then filed a false police report against him, but you've done it to the one man who, through his family's generosity, is responsible for a third of my department's annual budget. So when I ask him for his orders, I'm not really joking. He then turned to me, his face now a mask of grim professional duty. Mr. Sterling, he said, this man, he said, pointing to the now rumbling security guard, has, by your account, committed the crime of assault by physically blocking your legal entry. And this woman, he said, pointing to Brenda, has conspired to do so and has then filed a false police report, a crime she has committed in my presence. Do you wish to press charges? I looked at Brenda, at her crumbling face, at the ruin of her petty, arrogant world. I thought about the months of stress, of harassment, of the desecration of my family's peaceful legacy. Yes, Sheriff, I said, my voice calm and clear. I do, and so Brenda and her hired thug were arrested on the spot. But that was just the beginning of her downfall. My trust's lawyers, armed with the undeniable evidence of her sustained harassment and her material breach of the master lease agreement, immediately filed a lawsuit. We didn't just sue the HOA, we sued her and every single member of her board personally. And our primary legal action was not to get money, it was to terminate their lease. The HOA, of course, was thrown into utter chaos. The residents, who had been completely in the dark about their status as tenants, were now facing the very real possibility of being evicted from their multi-million-dollar homes. Brenda was not just a pariah. She was the architect of their potential ruin. The legal battle was short and brutal. They had no defense. Brenda was facing criminal charges. The HOA was facing a lawsuit from every single one of its own enraged homeowners. And they were all facing eviction from the quiet historian they had so foolishly and so arrogantly underestimated. In the end, I didn't evict them. That was not my way. That was not my family's way. But I did dismantle Brenda's kingdom. I used the power of my position as their landlord to force the complete and utter dissolution of the Pioneer Bluffs Homeowners Association. It was to be replaced by a simple and very limited Road and Utilities Maintenance Association with a permanent, controlling seat on its board held by me, the trustee. The hundreds of pages of ridiculous, tyrannical rules were burned in a bonfire. This whole brutal, ugly, and ultimately triumphant war taught me a profound lesson about the nature of power. There is the loud, arrogant, and temporary power of a title, of a position. Of a person like Brenda who builds a tiny kingdom on a foundation of rules and intimidation. And then there is the quiet, deep, and permanent power of the land itself, of history. Brenda thought she ruled a kingdom, but she was just a guest in my county. She was so busy trying to kick me out of my little cabin that she never realized she was just one signature away from being kicked out of her own, much grander and much more fragile house. Brenda's conviction on multiple charges is currently being appealed, and her legal team, which is being funded by a national anti-land grant political action committee, is now challenging the legitimacy of the original 1884 Sterling land grant in federal court. They are claiming it was an unconstitutional act of federal overreach, and that the entire county should be returned to the people.